So everybody's talking about racial discrimination right now, and that is a good thing. It's important that we have conversations about the country that we're trying to build as we move forward, and that we make sure that everyone in Canada has the same opportunity for success regardless of race, color, creed, gender, or anything else. And so that's a discussion that we should continue having, and I hope that it can be a productive discussion. That's what I try and do here with these videos, making sure that we can have a discussion talking about data points where we agree, where we disagree, and really see if we can move forward, because yelling into an echo chamber does nothing, and yelling at a wall where someone is not even listening to you equally does nothing. So in that spirit, Abacus has released a poll that I want to examine, and that poll talks about the views on racial discrimination. It was conducted for City News, and we'll pull up some of the questions from there. So this is the first question here, and it is, does discrimination happen in Canada today? The responses were 28% frequently, 37% quite often, 33% from time to time, and 1% never. We'll throw the 1% out the window because it's well within the margin of error, which is 2.3%, as you see on the bottom. So we basically have nearly 100%, or if you throw out the 1% as an outlier, we have basically 100% agreement that racial discrimination does happen in Canada, and then it's just really a debate on the frequency. Now, when you're looking at this poll, we don't have the background data that Abacus, the full data on people's age, people's gender, people's location, people's race or ethnicity, if they volunteer that information or if they ask that information. So we don't have any of this, and it's tempting to think that, this is a mix of everyone who lives in Canada. It may or may not be true. You don't know what the makeup of this group is. But we'll just say that it is a generic makeup of, example of the standard Canadian demographic, and so we'll just take it from there. So again, it's just everyone agrees. It's just a debate on the frequency, and so is it a lot? Is it a little? And what does a lot mean to you? What does a little mean to you? Could you be confused between frequently and quite often? I think that's reasonable. From time to time, same thing. Maybe you're not quite sure what that means. You don't believe that Canada is an overly racist country, but you think that from time to time there is racial discrimination, especially when you see something in the news, especially when you read about something. Then you might think, okay, this is one of those times where it happens, and you're more looking at the larger scale issues as opposed to the next question here, which we'll pull up, and that is the question on systemic or institutional racism. Now here, 29% said that there certainly is, 32% were pretty sure that there is, 30% said that there might be, and 9% said probably or certainly not. Now, again, with this question, we have to look at, are they defining, is there a pre-question, or can someone in the survey ask the question, what do you define as systemic or institutional racism? And this is, I think, the heart of a lot of the discussion that we're having right now. How are we defining systemic or institutional racism? If you look at the textbook letter of the law, then one of the main things which you could say would be that Canada is systemically or institutionally racist, possibly because of the Indian Act. I know a lot of people in the First Nations community have issues with the Indian Act. I've heard that there is a large consensus that they want to get rid of the thing. They just don't want to lose rights that they already feel that they have lost, or they don't want to lose treaty rights or land rights, these type of things. But by and large, that they don't really like the act. It's just a question of what do you replace it with without losing anything. So the sheer fact that we have an Indian Act and a law for one group of people that governs very specifically what happens to them, and other laws for other groups of people, you could say, okay, let's have that debate, or let's say flat out, you might say that the Indian Act is an example of systemic or institutional racism. And that's a good place to start, because now we're talking about something that is very specific, it's very definable, and you can have a proper discussion. The issue that's going on right now is that no one is defining in such a way that is understandable to someone who's not steeped in this. And I try to be steeped in this because this was something that I did for a living. I worked at a human rights organization for a number of years, and I've generally been very involved in combating anti-Semitism and working towards human rights. And so I might be more used to these type of words or these concepts than people who don't deal with this on a regular basis. And so I might have a different understanding of what systemic or institutional racism might be than the average person. And so systemic or institutional racism could be the societal outlook And that really is a word that used to be discussed that we don't talk about anymore, and that word is stereotyping. Stereotypes often, you might hear the word like unconscious bias, or again, this is sort of institutional racism or systemic racism. That's talking about the society, the system of the society. So again, without defining the terms here, it's difficult to say what it is, and it's difficult for us to say when we're trying to analyze this data point to say that everyone believes this. Now, just looking on what the answer was here, between the certainly and pretty sure, that's about half, so it's about 50%. The might be, again, they're not sure, so we'll take it as a not sure, and then 9% certainly or probably not. And again, if you say that there certainly or probably is not institutional racism or systemic racism, it really depends how you define that. If you want to say that there is no systemic racism or institutional racism because you don't think you're not aware of any law that says that one group is X and another group is Y, that would be why you might say no. Again, it really depends on how you define it. I think that if you're just talking about racism, you're probably safer to say that there is. So the 9%, I'd want to have a discussion with those 9% and really see if we can flesh out why they think that there isn't, and ask them what they think it means if we're not willing to say it ourselves. If the person asking the question is not willing to say what they are defining systemic or institutional racism as. Then we have here, do you yourself have racist views? And again, this is, I think, where we get into a lot of issues, because here, as the survey goes, you have 1% say a lot. I have a lot of racist views. That's, again, in the margin of error. Even if you did, I find it hard to believe that someone would really admit to such a thing. I mean, that's not a positive thing. I don't think that was ever really a positive thing in our society to say that I'm a racist person. I hate other people of other races. So I kind of find it hard to believe, but you never know. And either way, it's within the margin of error, so not statistically significant for this discussion. 22% said some, and so there you have you might feel you have some racist views. Maybe, again, this is stereotyping. Maybe you have some stereotypical views of different groups. And so when asked in this context, based on what's going on, based on sort of what we're all thinking about right now, the way that we're just having this discussion, you might say some. I have some racist views because they're stereotypical. And then you have 76% that said no. I have no racist views. A really interesting point with the next data set, and we're going to have to talk about both of them together. Is there discrimination against these groups in Canadian society today? So, number one, Muslims, people believe that 97% of people that there was discrimination against Muslims, 97% believe that this was true, 95% against black people, 95% against refugees, 94% against indigenous people. So, a couple things I want to pull out, and I'll start with the two data points. So, number one, back to here, you've got 76% of people saying that they do not have any racist views. But then you have 97%, and these are all high 90s or mid to high 90s, saying that these groups face racism. So my question is, the sum, the 22%, are these people making up for all of that racism and discrimination? Because if 76% say that they do not have racist views, there's got to be a couple of Hitlers here that are really weighing down the discrimination side. And so it doesn't really match. If you say that you do not have any racist views, and yet you also think that these groups face discrimination on a regular basis or are discriminated against, if the majority, and a high majority, 76%, are saying that they do not have racist views, but they also say that these groups face discrimination, you have to think that there are some really, really horrible people out there. And that's why these groups face discrimination. So it really doesn't jive, and I think that's something that we should all ask ourselves. If you think you have racist views, and I think it's fair to say that a lot of us might have stereotypical views, especially with groups that we don't think about often, or we're not exposed to often, we might not know anything about often, or we might know very little about, then we're exposed to maybe generalities or stereotypes. And that doesn't always have to be bad. You can stereotype or make a generalization without it being negative, or you having any negative intentions or ill will. And that's just what we do as humans. We generalize, and going into detail on every topic would simply cause our brains to explode because we don't have the mental capacity to deal with it, and so we make generalizations. But if you're going to be the 22% that say you have racist views, my question for those people is, what are you doing about it? If you think you have some racist views, but you're not even liking something on Facebook. You're not even retweeting something. You're not even doing this slacktivism, as they say. I really have a question for you. I mean, you're basically, what are you contributing to this? And you're not even doing anything. You're just a contributor to the racism. So that's the first on the double data points here. The second one is the fact that 97% of respondents believed that Muslims faced discrimination compared to 95% of black people. And so one of the things that I've been talking about is the fact that a lot of our Canadian discussion is really colored by the American experience. A lot of people, we watch so much American news, so much American TV, we watch so much American culture that it kind of becomes a part of our culture. I mean, how often, you might use an expression like, he's going 100 miles an hour, even though we don't use miles in this country. So there's a lot of American culture and a lot of American influence in Canada. And so everyone is familiar with the George Floyd issue, with the George Floyd protest and what happened to the guy. But it showed that 97% still believed, so 2% more, again, that's within the margin of error, but 2% more believed that Muslims faced discrimination than black people. And so this is an example that I would say goes through what happens when our political leaders talk about something. Now, oftentimes, people feel that it's virtue signaling, and it is. Our Prime Minister has done a lot of virtue signaling. A lot of times, people feel that it's a waste to have our politicians talk about something. But I would say that the high response rate for whether or not Muslims face discrimination, and they do, obviously they do. There's hate crime stats, which I have in another tab here I can pull up. But the fact that it is the highest group, I think, would speak to a lot of focus on what's going on in Quebec with Bill 21, a lot of focus on M103, a lot of focus on Islamophobia, and so clearly that's having an effect. People are understanding this, and that's becoming part of their thought process. With Black Canadians, again, the George Floyd incident obviously had an influence, I would say, especially since this is recent. But I think the numbers would have been super high regardless. I find it hard to believe that people would say that it's none, especially when there might be some overlap between different groups, as we're looking at all three. Refugees also 95%. That one I wasn't so sure about, because refugee, I can discriminate against a refugee if I know that someone is a refugee, or I can go online and say that refugees are bad, etc., and say I would never hire one, or whatever type of discrimination I want to do. But it's impossible to identify someone just walking down the street and say that they're a refugee. So that one is a bit interesting choice to throw in. Indigenous people 94%. Again, that's very high, which is also surprising, because a lot of times when I have spoken about this, people feel that there is none, or there isn't discrimination, and they have a lot of government benefits. They get a lot of things from the government, and so on one hand, I was, I'm in a weird position. I was going to say I was pleased. I wasn't pleased to see that people feel they're being discriminated against, but I guess I am pleased to see that they might be open to understanding what the Indigenous experience is like and hearing from those people. So I guess that is a good thing. So overall, that's the kind of the interesting mix. The thing that was interesting that I found is that when I conducted a survey through an organization I volunteer with called LAAD, we had a similar question about do you believe Jews people face discrimination, and we had Jews in addition to one of the list, and people felt that Muslims experience Islamophobia on a higher percentage than Jews experience anti-Semitism, even though, and here I'll pull up the actual stat. So this is the hate crime stats from 2018. Here you can see the dark blue is the green is the 2018 hate crime stats. So you can see that Jews were the number one victims of hate crimes for all 3 years, and Muslims are the second. A big spike in 2017, but Jews stayed very high rate of incidence on 2018. So again, just sort of an interesting mix. They didn't have to include it. I'm not, I have no issue with that, but just an interesting choice, and I think something that you may want to discuss. Just for reference to pull it up, since I have the tab here, this is the police reported hate crimes against people divided by race or ethnicity, and so you have Black Canadians as the #1 victim. And here in 2018, police reported 283 incidents motivated by hatred against the black population. And these are the hate crimes, the ones that are actually, someone is charged with a hate crime by the police. So overall, a lot of interesting points to discuss. And I think the main takeaway here is, I think we can all agree that there's racism and discrimination in Canada. I don't think anyone would say that there is none. Right? You'd be pretty hard-pressed to find someone who says that there's never any racism, that these people do not face any challenges at all. I think it's really just a discussion of the frequency, and I think it's a discussion of what does that racism look like. Is that stereotyping? Is that the unconscious bias that you see someone of see a person of color or someone of a different ethnicity and you automatically assume something, and that thing that you assume is automatically negative? Or what is the frequency? So again, the frequency up at the top here. The frequency with which this does happen and what areas it happens in. So overall, I think this is a discussion that we're going to have and we're going to continue to have as Canadians. They're definitely going to have that in the United States. That's going to be a huge discussion, and that I'm sure will stay with us well into the election season, which is coming up. But I think the most important thing is that we have that discussion in Canada, and we make sure that we have the Canadian discussion, because the Canadian experience is very, very different from the American experience. We don't have the same history. We don't have the same immigrant groups. We don't have the same immigrant waves. We don't have the same makeup of our population. And so it's important we have a discussion in a Canadian context. And I would like to continue that discussion with you. I really appreciate a lot of the comments and feedback that we get on some of these articles. And I know that has been something that has always attracted me to True North, to this organization, which I am happy to contribute to, because they are all about, and we are all about, having discussions and giving you the other side of the story, giving you the full context. And so please, let's have some interesting discussion. I'd love to come back with you and talk about maybe some of my experience and some of the stories I could tell about working for a human rights organization, dealing with police, dealing with policy and government officials and policymakers. And so I think that is something that we can definitely talk about. But in the meantime, for True North, I am Sam Eskenasi. Thank you very much for watching, and have yourself a great day and stay safe.